My general theme today is the gold standard in American history and banking in American history. But the way I approach it is the several myths which have been propounded by most economic historians, if not all. I wouldn't say all, but most, until recent years. And the two most important myths that I want to focus on is the first one is that which you've all probably heard if you've read about colonial monetary history, is that the colonial America suffered from a great shortage of specie, a shortage of gold and silver. And therefore, because of this shortage, the colonial governments had to print lots of paper money to make up for this deficiency. That's one myth, which I think we'll examine. The second myth, which has a whole bunch of subheads, which will take me more than enough time to go into, is the myth that the central banks in the United States the role of the central banks has always been to restrain the evil expansionary impulses and tendencies of private banks. And the private banks are free banks if they're allowed their head, tend to inflate too much, and therefore you need the central bank as a wise patron from on high, or God out of the machine, to fix things up, to control them and to moderate them, restrain their expansionary tendencies. And a sub-variant of that, of course, is if this is true, that means that the private banks, or the state banks as they were called in American history, because most of the banks were chartered by the states, that the state banks must have been chafing at the bit. They must have hated the central bank and wished for its extermination. The brunt of my talk is that the exact opposite has been true in all these cases. In the case of the central bank, the state banks were all for it and fought hard for its continuation or establishment. Okay. Myth number one about colonial America. We start off with it should seem peculiar to an economist. It's characteristic that most historians don't know anything about economics. Most economists don't know anything about history. For an economist, it sounds very peculiar. It should be a red flag to the bull to start talking about a shortage of specie. And if colonial America suffered from a terrible money shortage, why couldn't we buy specie? I mean, there was, after all, transportation going back and forth. There was plenty of trade back and forth to Europe. There were plenty of coins, silver and gold coins around. Why couldn't we simply buy them to transport specie to America and use it? So that's the first thing we should set off a light in one's noodle. It's true that the British government, suffering from mercantilist fallacies, as most American governments did too, they were actually part and parcel of the same British Empire, passed a law that the Americans colonies couldn't have mints, and also try to keep British specie in Britain. However, we didn't need British specie. As a matter of fact, most of the coins that we used were Spanish silver dollars, which we can import from Spain. And we also used later on Austrian Maria Theresa sovereigns, units, etc. So we didn't really need English coin, and indeed we used Spanish and other foreign coins, Portuguese coins, Austrian coins, etc., etc. So the first problem then is if there was a so-called shortage of specie, why didn't we buy any? Why didn't Americans simply buy this stuff from abroad? So it turns out, because whenever an economist hears the word shortage, he or she should immediately start saying, well, what do you mean shortage? There is no shortage in the free market. There's plenty of scarcity in the free market, as we all know. There's no shortage. There's no situation you can't find something. For example, Rembrandts are very scarce, quite obviously. On the other hand, there's no Rembrandt shortage. I haven't heard anybody bellyaching about a Rembrandt shortage. If you want to pay $1.5 million, you can find a Rembrandt to buy. Okay. So the question then is, what's interfering with this mechanism that doesn't permit shortages? As a matter of fact, a shortage is only the result of government intervention of a maximum price control. Okay. If for example, the government suddenly decreed for some obscure reason. Of course, you people in the heart of government, you can know better than I do why would they do such a thing. They might suddenly decree that Wonder Bread, which is now selling at something like 89 cents a loaf, should only sell for 10 cents a loaf in order to help the American masses eat their Wonder Bread, right? Because every kid deserves at least a loaf a day. So if the government then decreed this and said, okay, from now on there's a maximum price control of 10 cents on every loaf of Wonder Bread, there would be an instantaneous shortage. Okay? In other words, people would rush out and buy Wonder Bread for a dime a loaf. They'd shift from Silver Cup and Tasty Bread and Pepperidge Farms and all the other goodies, because it's now only a dime. In the meantime, the Wonder Bread manufacturers would stop producing Wonder Bread for a dime a loaf, and so we'd have it very quickly a Wonder Bread shortage. Couldn't find it on the shelf. A black market would then develop with people with mysterious folks and with raincoats on shady street corners offering hot Wonder Bread for $5 a loaf. So the whole phenomenon of the shortage only exists, I think it's safe to say, fair to say that a shortage only exists in the world when there's a government maximum price control below the free market level. So therefore, the constant complaining about a shortage of specie in colonial America should lead one on to think, well, there must be some government involved somewhere, and indeed there was. Specifically, we have Gresham's Law, which is unfortunately, this is sort of a side point, but I think it's an interesting one. Gresham's Law is almost always stated incorrectly. It's stated that the first person I can think I've been able to find, I did some studying of this, who enunciated Gresham's Law was not Gresham, of course. I mean, it's way before Gresham. It was Aristophanes, the great Greek satiric playwright, his marvelous play, The Frogs. And in The Frogs, he enunciates the incorrect version of Gresham's Law, which is that bad money drives good money out of the market. In other words, the implication is there's something peculiar about money, where for bad money, a crummy money, a debased money, depreciated money, if it's circulating side by side with good money, say gold, that somehow gold will disappear and paper will outcompete it, or bad money will outcompete it. And this is very peculiar, because usually on the free market, it's just the opposite. Usually good products will outcompete bad products. If you have a radio that doesn't work, competing with radios that do work, the non-working radio is going to disappear pretty quickly, even without a OSHA or whatever other government bureau. So, but unfortunately, Aristophanes stated it incorrectly. He said, he had a little poem about it. He said, first of all, in our republic, bad citizens are preferred to good, just as bad money circulates while good money disappears. From Aristophanes, it's interesting, you can say that now even. Then he had a little poem where he said, for your old and standard pieces, valued and approved and tried, here among the Grecian nations and in all the world beside, recognized in every realm for trusty stamp and pure essay, are rejected and abandoned for the trash of yesterday, for a vile adulterate issue, glossy, counterfeit, and base. Okay, so the first, as far as I can find out, the first proper statement of Gresham's Law, which stated it correctly, was by the great 14th century French physicist, astronomer, and mathematician Nicole Orem, who stated it correctly. He then went on to become Bishop of Lisieux, and essentially saying that he said, quote, if the fixed legal ratio of the coins differs from the market value of the metals, the coin which is underrated entirely disappears from circulation, and the coin which is overrated alone remains current. Beautiful statement. Essentially, in other words, if there are two monies circulating, if the government puts a maximum price control on the good money and a minimum price control between the two of them on the lousy money, the good money will disappear from circulation. There's a compulsory, in other words, people will then pay their debts and so forth and crummy money and hold on to the good one, either hoarding it or exporting it abroad. So in the 14th century, we already had that position. And then the great astronomer Nicholas Copernicus, who was also a canon lawyer, artist, and physician, was asked by the King of Poland to offer proposals for currency reform. Everything was messed up with the currency. So in the early 16th century, he set forth an essay on money, in which he used the correct version of Gresham's Law, saying if the government overvalues one coin or one money, undervalues the other, the undervalued one will be hoarded, melted down, or exported, and the quote, the degraded coin alone remains in circulation. Okay, so he had the whole thing. Now, Gresham himself apparently did enunciate Gresham's law, indeed, but he was not the one who made the famous memorandum on it, which was really Sir Thomas Smith, who was a big shot Tudor official and bureaucrat and financier. At any rate, so the true version, the correct version of Gresham's law is simply an application, as Mises pointed out many times, an application of the theory of price control causing shortages to money, to two monies operating side by side. Well, what happened in colonial America is precisely the working out of Gresham's law in action. For one thing, what the colonial governments did started to undervalue specie and overvalue their own crummy pound notes that Massachusetts and other governments were putting out. In other words, they engaged in continuing debasement of their own currency units and artificially undervaluing a specie. So the result was a specie disappearing and too much Massachusetts paper and not enough specie in circulation. So there's a whole, I have a written paper which goes through all the statistics on this, which I'm sure there's nothing more deadly in the world than hear statistics being read, so I'll spare you all that. But at any rate, that's what happens. The definition of the shilling is also starts being manipulated, so the shilling will have more and more, less and less weight to it, less and less weight of silver, the Massachusetts shilling and the Connecticut shilling, each one competitively debasing in order to try to subsidize their exports and limit their imports and try to bring specie into this country, into the colony. In neither case did it really work very well. While this was going on, the two important things happened in the history of money in the 1690s. It was a dramatic decade for the history of world money. One thing that happened was that the governments discovered government paper. They hadn't used it before. It had, as far as I can see, outside of China, which of course invented both paper and printing long before we did in the West, and therefore went through the whole cycle about several centuries before the West did. But of course nobody knew what was going on in China, so it was a totally isolated kind of situation. Outside of China, there had been no government paper money issues before 1690, 1692. Actually 1690. There had been paper banknotes, and government coins, which the government was progressively debasing by juggling standards of weight. But there hadn't been any actually government issues of paper money. The invention of government paper then belongs to the credit or the blame of Massachusetts, the royal government of Massachusetts. What happened was that there was a custom in those days for Massachusetts troops to go out and raid and plunder the French in Quebec, and in Nova Scotia. The French were very productive fishermen. They didn't have too many people up there, but they had a lot of fish and furs and so forth. So every 3 or 4 years, Massachusetts troops would go up there and plunder it. And they come back with the loot to Boston and auction it off and pay the soldiers out of the proceeds. Sort of a pirate expedition, is the best way I can describe it. This was one of the customs of Massachusetts, which we don't hear about on the bicentennials. But at any rate, and the French being outnumbered usually lost. Well, this time the French won. And before 1690, there was a plunder expedition. We go out there and steal the fish and the furs. And they had a good fort there, and they're ready for us. And anyway, they won. So the troops come back, not only with no booty, no loot, and also not getting paid. One of the great insights we have in history is that in the course of history, when soldiers don't get paid, they get very, very edgy. Okay? So you have a lot of edgy people with guns. This makes the government very upset, very, very worried. They don't like this. So Massachusetts government is wildly looking around for some way to pay the soldiers. And they of course didn't have any credit, they didn't have any gold. As usual, they're in bad fiscal shape, as true of almost any government. So they decide, why don't we just issue paper notes, call it pounds, and to pay them with that. Hope this works. So in December 1690, Massachusetts issued the first government paper money in the Western world. 7,000 pounds in paper notes to pay the salaries of these soldiers. Now they couldn't just say paper, couldn't just say pounds because it wouldn't be accepted. So Massachusetts made a solemn twofold pledge. You know about pledges in politics. 2 pledges, which they would ever always to keep. One, that they redeem the notes in specie in a few years. Few years is a little vague, but a few years. And 2, that it would absolutely make no further issues of paper money. This was it, 7,000 pounds, and from then on they quit. Well, as usually happens in this situation, the discovery of paper money is a wonderful thing for the government because nothing much happens at first. The world doesn't come to an end. You issue paper, you pay off your debts. Hey, this is great. Prices go up a little bit, but not really too much at first. So it seems to the government they have a magic open sesame here. Like, boy, they can solve all the problems. They don't have to increase taxes. They don't have to, nothing much would happen. Just print money and spend it. Whoopee. So, so in a few years, the idea of redemption faded away. It was forgotten, the idea of specie redemption. And the pledge limit itself evaporated only a few months. As a matter of fact, as early as February. That means 2 months after they issued they swore up and down 7,000 pounds and that's it forever. They said the 7,000 pound issue had fallen far short, as they put it. Far short of their needs, right? So they proceeded to issue 40,000 pounds of new money. Oh, hey, this is fantastic. Rev it up, kid. In order to pay all the colony's debts, past, present, and whatever. And then again saying this is it. From now on, this is the final issue. Of course, they kept issuing forever, for many years. And only 1 year, the paper money had depreciated by 40%. And at that point, 2 pamphlets were written. I don't know the names. I think anonymous pamphlets attacking the public. This is interesting. Attacking the public for being delinquent and sottish, as they call it, for buying these notes and only accepting these notes at only 40% off. They should be at par. They said, after all, the government is a democratically elected government. It's a government of their own choosing. They must, therefore, they're honor bound to consider these paper money at par with specie. So, of course, these exhortations didn't work. At that point, and a year later, after the exhortations didn't work, this always happens, by the way, when voluntary exhortations don't work, when the government officials say, okay, you and you stop spending to stop inflation, let's say, and that obviously doesn't work, then they say, okay, from now on we take off the gloves. And the old joke about Hitler, okay, from now on no more Mr. Nice Guy. So a year later, they're giving them a chance to voluntarily accept the depreciated notes at par. The Massachusetts government made the paper money compulsory legal tender for all debts at par. And that's, of course, specie starts disappearing like mad. And they kept issuing more paper, and the paper kept depreciating, and the silver kept disappearing. Okay, and then they tried a public land bank, saying the land is backing it and still issuing paper notes. Didn't make much difference. The result was still depreciation, rapid inflation, disappearance of specie. This continued. This was then copied by most of the other colonies, if not all, and resulting in a, quote, shortage of specie, unquote, because the government said, here we have 40% depreciated notes. You must accept this as part of specie. Everybody said, nuts to you. And they hoard the specie and melt it down or send it abroad. Okay, when Parliament finally prohibited all paper money issues in the 1750s, the shortage was eliminated. The shortage suddenly disappeared, as often happens. Okay, that's the shortage of specie bit. The next major point is about central banking and the relationship with the private banks or state banks. As I said, the usual contention is, or myth is, that the central banking was necessary in order to restrain the inflationary tendencies of the private banks, and therefore the private banks were really against the central bank and tried to eliminate it. My contention is the result, just as the true facts, so to speak, just as in the case of the shortage, were just the opposite. True facts were that the central bank was put in by the banks in order to inflate the money supply and enable them all to inflate. In other words, the central bank acts as a cartelization device, just as the Farm Price Support Program, the Federal Farm Support Program since 1929, has acted as a giant cartelization device for farm products, so as to cut production and raise prices, or try to cut production and raise prices. Similarly, the central bank acts as a bank cartel device to enable all the banks to inflate together, so that the natural free banking checks on inflation would be eliminated. And therefore, the private banks more or less usually either both defended the creation of the banks and the central bank and fought against their abolition, in contrast to the myth, the exact opposite of the usual historical myth. As I should have said about the first myth, the real story was, of course, that instead of saying that there was a shortage of specie and the governments had to issue paper to fill in the shortage, it was precisely the government issue paper that created the shortage. Okay, so this is similarly the central bank situation is the exact opposite of the usual historical story. Okay, we start off with central banking. First of all, during the Revolutionary War, there was no bank. I mean, banks did not develop at that point, or they had disappeared. The first commercial bank in the new republic was also the first central bank, the Bank of North America. This was a plan fulfilling the nationalist program. There was, just to say very briefly about the American Revolution. The American Revolution essentially consisted of two groups of people, two groups of ideologies, two ideological, very diametrically opposed groups. One group, which was the majority of the public, I think there's no question about that, which mostly in the rural areas, subsistence rural areas, believed in a very minimal government. In other words, they believed the American Revolution was a libertarian revolution. The object was to throw off big government altogether, not just the British government, but any big government, and to eliminate almost all government authority, cut taxes down to an absolute minimum, cut the budget down to the absolute minimum, have free trade, free markets, gold or silver standard, no paper. In other words, extreme laissez-faire or libertarian program. This was basically the so-called anti-federalist position, which was held by the majority of the public. But on the other hand, you had a small but powerful group of people, the nationalists, who call themselves the Federalists because it sounds better. The nationalist program, which believed just the opposite. The nationalists wanted to recreate the British Empire without Britain. It was to recreate the entire structure of a big government, mercantilist policies, essentially back to the old mercantilist policies, with high tariffs, big public works program, heavy public debt, and high taxes to pay for the public debt and pay off the public debt, and a central bank which would inflate the money supply in an orderly manner, of course. Orderly means run by the government, and using the cheap money to subsidize favored business groups and favored projects. So basically, the nationalists were essentially the embryonic development of what we have now. It's sort of looking back and saying, okay, this is the beginning of the welfare warfare state. So they wanted a British Empire without Great Britain, and they wanted a very strong president, very strong federal government, and a very strong president as the chief executive, as a quasi-monarch, if not in name, then in fact. So we have then the so-called Hamiltonian vision. It was really a vision of Robert Morris, the first central banker, and Hamilton was his disciple, and Morris was his mentor, versus the so-called Jeffersonian vision of the ultra-minimal government. Morris, during the Revolutionary War, for various reasons, became an economic and financial dictator, a czar of the whole system. Morris has been called the financier of the American Revolution. That's the name which has been attached to him. Actually, as usual, it's just the exact opposite was correct. The American Revolution financed him. Okay. He stole millions. It's unbelievable. He was the first place, the accounting. I mean, politicians steal now, of course, but those days there was no rigorous accounting methods. There's no independent audit. There was no GAO. There's no nothing. We still don't know how many millions he stole. But basically, what happened was he was a very wealthy merchant in Philadelphia. He became the economic financial czar of the Continental Congress. He then parceled out all the contracts all the war contracts, printing money or borrowing money, parceling out all the war contracts to either his own firm or his own partners or his own associates. So you have enormous things where Robert Morris buys stuff from France on Robert Morris ships, and the total interpenetration of the Treasury funding, Treasury bank account, so to speak, in his own bank account. It was almost impossible to clear it up. But anyway, millions got siphoned from the taxpayer or the person who pays it for inflation to the pockets of Robert Morris and his associates. So one of the things that Morris was the chief nationalist. He was the main person who had this great vision of a new British Empire without Britain. And one of his visions was to have a central bank, which he, of course, would run. And he, during the Revolutionary War, he had Congress charter this Bank of North America in Philadelphia, which was supposed to be the first central bank. It was also the first commercial bank. And one of the privileges which the bank got was no other commercial bank was allowed to exist for at least 20 years except this bank. In other words, this was a monopoly bank. Okay. Also, the Treasury would put all of its deposits in this bank. The bank notes would be receivable in all taxes to the government, federal and state governments, on par with specie, and et cetera, et cetera. And of course, all the federal debt would then be purchased by the Bank of North America. In addition to that, the public debt, which Morris and his friends had already purchased, could be deposited in the bank, and then they would become backing for more bank notes. So Morris benefited 6 ways to Sunday here. As a matter of fact, he was supposed to have a certain amount of specie capital in the bank. He couldn't raise enough specie. So what he did is he took a loan. France loaned $462,000 in specie to America for the war effort. Morris appropriated $264,000 of it, put it into the Bank of North America to meet the legal requirement for specie capital. So it's great if you can get away with it, I suppose. After the war, after a year or two, after the war, when the war was coming to an end, he began to lose political power, and he quickly disconnected the Bank of North America as a central bank. It became then a straight commercial bank. He divested all the government funding from it. By the way, I think justice does not always triumph in the world, as you all know. In the case of Robert Morris, however, justice triumphed. He died about 10 years later in debtor's prison, totally bankrupt in debtor's prison. So I think he really met his just desserts. However, being a man in favor of the public debt, private debt, and everything else, however, even with Morris's coming to a defeat, his disciple Alexander Hamilton continued on, and of course the Constitution was driven through the country in a blitzkrieg vote in the middle of the winter. This is very important because those days, first of all, there weren't any roads then. I mean, I wouldn't say no roads, but not many roads. Okay, so communications were very sparse, to say the least. Federalists had control of all the cities, and they also had control of the post office. And by the way, they used the monopoly post office to their advantage. They deliberately speeded up any communications between Federalist leaders, and they withheld communications between anti-Federalist leaders. So it would take 8 months for a Virginia anti-Federalist to send a letter to an anti-Federalist in Massachusetts. It took like a week for the Federalists to communicate. So at any rate, so they used this advantage. They pushed through the stuff in the winter when it was icy. And the roads were no good. And the anti-Federalists couldn't communicate with their people who were essentially subsistence farmers in the backwoods who found it very difficult to mobilize. So they used the blitzkrieg approach, and it was quite effective. At any rate, even so, they bought out most of the legislatures. In New York, for example, New York voted 2-1 against the Constitution. 2-1. When they got to the state ratification conventions, which were supposed to decide, half of them shifted their vote, or enough shifted the vote to ratify, even though they won their election on the basis of a pledge to vote against the Constitution. They were bought out, literally and figuratively. At any rate, as soon as the Nationalists get into power, they push the Constitution through. One of the first things they did is set up the Hamilton Central Bank, first bank of the United States. One of the major reasons, according to Hamilton, was, quote, to overcome the alleged, quote, scarcity of specie. We're back again, so it's being used now to justify a central bank. At any rate, to speed things up a bit here, Historical myth is that the first bank of the United States was extremely sound, and they repressed the state banking, inflation, et cetera, et cetera. It was just the opposite. They were not very sound. They inflated quite a bit, and they spurred state banks to come into action. After the first bank came in, the result was a lot more state banks, a lot more inflated bank credit. When the Jeffersonians got in, this is the old story, of course, by the way, you all know too well. The Jeffersonian movement was supposed to be dedicated to smashing this whole apparatus, smashing the monopoly Supreme Court, the central bank, the tariff, and all the rest of it. As soon as Jefferson gets into power, he becomes quote, a statesman, unquote. In other words, he sells out. It becomes what they now call pragmatic. And so what happens is the Democrat Republicans, half of them become pragmatists, and they become very close to the moderate federalists. That means those who didn't want an absolute monarchy. And so what you have between 1800 and 1815 or so, you have an amalgamation of the moderate Republicans and the moderate Federalists into one big centrist blob, essentially continuing and accelerating the whole bank credit inflation with the first bank. Well, the first bank charter was up in 1911. It was a big fight whether it should be repealed or not. Madison, who was the epitome of the centrist moderate, of the pragmatic moderate, opportunist moderate, was all in favor of it. He tried desperately to renew the bank, but enough disgruntled Federalists plus old-fashioned, what they call old Republicans, that means hardcore Jeffersonian types, swung enough votes to defeat it by one vote in the House and in the Senate. So, at that point, we could say, well, we finally did not have a central bank after the first time in American history. Didn't we have free banking then? No, we didn't, because what happened then was that we got into the War of 1812, and the War of 1812 was extremely unpopular in New England. War with England. New England had most of the manufactured goods, most of the armament equipment, and most of the banks. And so, how's the Madison administration going to finance the war effort? The way they financed it was by encouraging a whole bunch of new banks which suddenly popped up in Pennsylvania and Kentucky and other states. Essentially money factories with almost no specie capital, just printing paper dollars and using it to buy U.S. government bonds. So this is a sort of a happy situation for the banks. I mean, all they had to do is to print new money. And they buy the bonds, and the taxpayers are pledged to pay them back, quote unquote, plus interest. I mean, it's a good deal if you can work it. You create new money, and then for the service that you perform in the country by creating new money, you then pay back. You load it on the taxpayer for the next 30, 40 years. So what happened, however, of course, is the government, the administration had to use the money from Pennsylvania, Kentucky, et cetera, to buy stuff in New England. New England banks did not inflate. New England didn't want to pay for the war effort anyway. New England banks then call upon the inflated banks for redemption. They didn't have the money. How are they going to pay in specie? At that point, we had a big watershed situation in the summer of 1814. The banks were essentially bankrupt. It means all the banks outside New England. The federal government and state governments then said, okay, we will now permit the banks to suspend specie payments. That means to continue an operation, continue lending money, printing money, lending it out, and forcing their debtors to pay them back. But they didn't have to pay their depositors or their note holders. They were relieved from responsibility, a contractual responsibility of paying the paper money in specie. So of course they loved that. More banks then pop into action. And this situation of fiat individual paper. I mean, it's just like I could print dollars and lend them out. Essentially, that was something like that. This situation continued for 2.5 years, long after the war. After the war was over, the Madison administration, now the Monroe administration, was confronted with a choice. They have to do something. They couldn't have a permanent system of 100 banks in the country, each issuing dollars, not having to pay for it. That's obviously not going to work for any length of time. So what could be done? Well, two policies were offered. One was the old-fashioned Jeffersonian policy, so-called old Republican, which some of the Federalists now went along with in order to make trouble, which was a policy of forcing the banks to redeem or else go out of business. Okay? Force the banks to redeem and gold and silver or else get out. This, however, was not the sort of thing that moderates, quote unquote, of any stamp enjoy. And so the Monroe administration made a deal with the banks to create a central bank, new second bank of the United States, which would then validate, which first of all would validate all the inflated paper which had been going on for the last 3 years, and also continue inflating the money supply, which they did. So the second bank was put through, and it was then used. Then it started inflating like mad. It printed $6 million in these areas where the banks were shaky, and it started printing like mad, inflating like mad, thereby creating a big boom in the first big depression in the United States history of 1819. Once again, I should underline one thing here. The state banks were all for it. The state banks were all in favor of the first bank in the United States. They were all in favor of keeping it or against abolishing it. They were also all in favor of creating a second bank, because otherwise they would have had to go under. Also a couple of worthies should be mentioned here as instrumental in this whole operation. The first Bank of the United States, the president was William Bingham, who was the Philadelphia merchant who was the partner of Robert Morris, thereby continuing the Philadelphia oligarchy connection. And during the War of 1812, Stephen Girard, who was the second wealthiest person in the country, he's a Philadelphia merchant, was heavily invested in war debt. He bought a lot of government bonds, and he also heavily invested in the First Bank of the United States. He then decided he wanted to create another second Bank of the United States in order to, one, have the second bank buy all of his war debt, buy all the government bonds from him, which would be very useful, and two, he could then invest heavily in the second bank. So Girard, being politically powerful, teamed up with John Jacob Astor, the first wealthiest person, who was also heavily invested in war debt and Bank of the United States bonds, stock. The two of them got together and pushed through the Madison administration the appointment of Alexander Dallas to be Secretary of Treasury from Philadelphia Pallad there. Dallas was a lawyer for the Girard interests. And Dallas puts through the second bank and then retires, his job having been accomplished. Girard also got as president of the bank William Jones, another Philadelphia crony of theirs. So they have the whole Philadelphia connection, which continues on, by the way, for another 30 years or so, in running the whole central banking operation. Another person I should also mention here, probably the top moderate, quote-unquote moderate Jeffersonian Democrat Republican in the country, was Senator Samuel Smith of Maryland, a very powerful figure. Smith, in the course of the inflation of the Bank of the United States when it first got started, there was also outright cookery going on, enormous number of outright thievery by the Baltimore and Baltimore branch of the Bank of the United States. Millions got siphoned off into the pockets of the guy named Buchanan and his clerk. Who was Buchanan? Buchanan was a partner of Smith Buchanan Company, the major mercantile firm in Baltimore, which is owned by Samuel Smith, the senior partner. Now, since his senior partner and his clerk were the two biggest crooks in this operation, I figure if Buchanan and the other guy were crooks, could Samuel Smith have been far behind on this operation? I would doubt it. At any rate, the Bank of the United States continues on after the creation of the Depression, and Nicholas Biddle then becomes the head of the bank, again part of the Philadelphia oligarchy, the last in the line which started with Robert Morris. And when Andrew Jackson comes in, he starts a titanic struggle which finally eliminates the central bank and divests the government from the banking system, which Van Buren and Polk then completed. It should be pointed out, something we didn't know until fairly recently, is that the state banks basically were in favor of the Bank of the United States, wanted to continue and favored Biddle in the famous fight against Jackson. So why did Jackson do it? He did it because basically he was a libertarian. He was a hard money advocate and libertarian. He and his associates had read all the classical economic literature, the pre-Mises literature, so to speak, and were convinced by it. They also were stung by the Panic of 1819. They realized that bank credit and bank contraction, expansion and contraction of credit was responsible for the business cycle, and they were against it. And they thought it was ruinous. And so you have, for the first time, classical liberal or libertarian ideologues, so to speak, responsible for a mighty and titanic reform. The next step, as far as they were concerned, was to eliminate the state banks too and have a 100% gold system. They didn't accomplish that, largely because the slavery question split the Democratic Party in half by the late 40s, late 1840s. Okay, the next, I just have time to say just very briefly about the Federal Reserve System. I could go on for another couple of weeks on that, but the Federal Reserve System is a very similar story. In other words, the Federal Reserve System was put in by big banks. The bill was written. It took a few years for jockeying around for position and for exactly what sort of law should be passed. But all the banks were in favor of, all the large banks were in favor of the Federal Reserve System in order to provide, quote, elasticity, unquote, of the money supply. In other words, in order to permit inflation of money, expansion of the money supply, which they couldn't do very much under the national banking system. They ran up against a stone wall, especially during recessions. They wanted a sluice gate, a lender of last resort, a centralizer of reserves. In other words, pop a government to come in and cartelize the banking system for them, and this is what they did. Nobody in those days, none of the bankers said we are in favor of a central bank in order to restrain our evil appetite for inflation. It was quite the opposite. They needed the central bank in order to coordinate and promote expansion of money, which is essentially what they did, and essentially what they got from then on. The Federal Reserve, I think, very happily confirmed their judgment and has done this ever since. It's responsible now, of course, for continuing and accelerated inflation. In between, responsible for big depressions. As you all probably know, the Federal Reserve was put in order to stabilize the business cycle, supposedly, is one of the supposed advantages, to eliminate depressions and inflation. Instead of that, we got the largest inflation, most chronic inflation, and the biggest depression in American history since the Fed has come on the scene. Obviously, it must be doing something wrong, but more than something, I think it itself is wrong. It is the problem. And okay, thank you very much for this.